Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is our final lecture for the week. This is The War to End All Wars, the American involvement in the First World War. We'll touch here a little bit on the history of the war, the cost of the war, and why we called it the War to End All Wars. Why we hoped that this massive loss of life would be the last time that humanity would ever attempt death on this scale. And it really was the perfect industrialization of death, the perfection of scientific death as people understood it in 1917, 1918. So what got the United States into war? Like I said, in 1915, the Lusitania was torpedoed, and yet that didn't get us into war. What finally did? After the Lusitania, the Germans pulled back on unrestricted submarine warfare, only going after the British and allied nations' military vessels. However, in 1917, things were not going too well for the Germans. Honestly, it was a stalemate on the land between both sides. And in an effort to break the stalemate, the Germans decided to bring back unrestricted submarine warfare as a means to disable the island nation and its allies. It also helps that the Russians had dropped out of the war. They had been on the side of the British, and they had their own little civil war, and the Bolsheviks had stepped in, pulling Russia completely out of the war, but we'll talk about that in another lecture because that'll have ramifications with us later. Unrestricted submarine warfare is hope. It hopes that this will pull the British down by limiting their supplies, and the Germans really don't care at this point about international ideology. It's been 3 years of slug fest back and forth. And so what we see is a return to unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans have also begun to do sabotage on American soil. They have attempted, and in some cases successfully blown up American factories. They have rallied pro-German interests in this country. And remember, we'd had a big wave of Germans come over in the 1840s. We'd had even more Germans come over after the American Civil War. There were still people in this country who didn't speak or read English. There were people in this country who still spoke German and read German and had probably a greater loyalty to the German government than they did to the country that they immigrated to. Am I saying they were bad immigrants? No. I'm saying that these were people who had relatives still in Germany. These were people who had known Germany all their life until they came over to the United States. The United States was a backwater internationally. The United States was, in essence, the second world. And so there were people who still owed allegiances to the German government, the German military, for a way of life they had known before their immigration. And let's face it, prior to the First World War, the U.S. wasn't any great shakes internationally. It would be like, I'm not going to try and come up with an analogy, but there were Germans coming to the United States to commit sabotage. There were Germans living within the borders of the United States that no one knew how they would behave if we went to war. Turns out they behaved like loyal Americans because they did choose this country to live in. But no one knew that at the time. We also have in January of 1917, the Zimmerman telegram is captured. Now, what this were intercepted. In essence, what this is a telegram from the German embassy in Mexico City to the Mexican government essentially saying, if you come in on the side of of Germany, if you help Germany in the First World War, in this Great War, by attacking the United States and keeping the United States out of international affairs or the European war, when we win, we will reward you with New Mexico and Arizona and all the territories you lost to the United States in the 1840s. The Zimmerman telegram is the final nail in the coffin of getting America into war. We had, here we have, here we have a sovereign German nation giving away American territory should the Germans win the war and the Mexicans help them. This is more than most people can stand. This is what's going to outrage Americans. This is going to drive America into getting into the war. This is what the war in Europe looks like. If you see that main red line, that's the Hindenburg line. That's the main trench line. Honestly, what you're looking at, you can see that we have Northwest Europe 1914, and supposedly in blue is the Western Front in 1917. It's really hard finding separate lines, separate blue lines from that red line. You know what that means? That's really the state of the war as it existed the war had stagnated almost immediately in Europe. The Germans had rolled through and attacked through Belgium. The British and the French stopped them in northwestern France. And this line that stretched, in essence, all the way from the English Channel throughout France and down to the Italian border had not changed drastically in 4 years. Imagine being at war for 4 years and not having the lines move in any major way in that entire period of time, just constantly bombarding each other back and forth. Maybe there will be attacks and you'll be successful temporarily and you'll gain 100 yards, maybe you'll gain a mile, and then the Germans will counterattack and they'll push everything back to where things had been originally. That's about as stagnant as you can have militarily. This is the situation. And the British and the French, they want the United States in on their side because they want an infusion of fresh troops to help fight the British. They had fought to a standstill. There had been millions of casualties for no real military victory. Unfortunately, it's going to take the American Army time to ramp up and prepare for the trench warfare of the Western Front. The American military is maybe 50,000 people total, maybe 75,000 enlistees in 1917. It will have over 1 million men served during the First World War. You have to train all of those men, and you can't train them all at once. We don't have the facilities. So the American ramp up to war will be slow. It will take us at least 6 months to 9 months to get people prepared to serve, to know how to use a weapon, to how to behave in a military situation. This isn't the Civil War in the 1860s where you're going to send barely trained or untrained people up to the front. You have to train them in how to use weapons, how to act in a militaristic manner, how to salute, how to have discipline. All that takes time. This is a British trench, but honestly, even after American involvement, this is what an American trench is going to look like. We've all heard the horrors of life in the trenches, and they're true. Please understand the 2 bodies that we have laying here, those aren't dead. They're actually just sleeping in the trenches. We have 1 man on guard up at the top here. This is the reality of a soldier on the Western Front. Those lines that stagnated had devolved into a series of opposing trenches for soldiers to take cover. We have the firing step here that the soldier is kneeling on, so that, when you're not on the firing step, we have the main area for walking in the trench. This keeps you hidden from bullets. This hopefully protects you from artillery fire. We have the constant work of maintaining these trenches, and you'll live here for weeks at a time. You'll be rotated back to rear areas for showers and clean clothes and rest, because a soldier can't live in this state the entire time that they're serving. But this is the reality of life when you are at the front facing the Germans. It is dirty, it is dangerous, and it is demoralizing. As I said at the beginning of the lecture, we talk about the First World War as the perfection of scientific death. What we mean there is, yes, we'll eventually talk about poison gas, but all of the advances of the early 20th century are going to come into play and be given a military use in order to try and win this war. In the upper right-hand corner, we have the machine gun, something invented at the end of the 19th century. You can now fire. We have an American military that in the 1860s resisted giving away weapons to its soldiers that fired more than one round every 15 to 20 seconds, to being able to fire hundreds of rounds a minute. We have the airplane, invented by the Americans in 1903. It's going to be first used to scout out positions, the cavalry of the sky. Then pilots will carry hand grenades and drop them on troops below them. They'll carry pistols and mount machine guns on their airplanes to try and strafe enemy positions and shoot down other airplanes. We'll have the creation of the first heavy bombers as a means of bringing death from the sky, more accurate than artillery fire. On the lower right, we have barbed wire, an American invention from the 1870s meant to enable fencing off the plains in areas that didn't have a lot of trees. Now we can entangle hundreds of miles of barbed wire along our front and trap humans as a means to make killing them easier. The British will invent the tank in 1915, 1916. It's slow, it's cumbersome, but it's mobile artillery. It is the land battleship. All of these means are science and technology being perfected as a means to kill humans. And probably the ultimate representation of that is the gas attack. The Germans, very quickly followed by other forces, will perfect a means to weaponize chlorine gas, phosgene gas, nerve agents, even tear gas, which will simply make mucus run and make your eyes water. This is remote killing. This is the promise of using chemistry to clear out an enemy's position to be able to attack them without losing many men on your side. The top picture is actually an aerial picture of a gas attack, and what we have is a line of places where artillery shells have exploded, and the wind is pushing back those clouds of gas into the lines of the people being attacked. It's any number of agents. You can't tell from the air. You can't tell what this type of agent is in a black and white photograph. It could just be tear gas. It could be poison gas that's burning the lungs of the men who aren't able to get their gas masks on in time. You see British gas masks down here in the lower right. If you don't get your gas mask on in time, you see the casualties. Here in the lower left, eyes that are burning, mucous membranes that are burnt and destroyed through chemical reaction, men who can no longer see, can no longer breathe well because of chemical agents. You'll see these lines coming back from the front lines. The reason in the lower left that they have their hands on their shoulders, their eyes have been injured because of poison gas. And so you'll see lines of tens or 20s or hundreds of men with their hands on the shoulder of the man in front of them, shuffling along, going back to hospitals, because that's the only way that they can see is through somebody pulling them along, jerking them along, following the man in front of them after their eyes have been injured by the poison gas. Hopefully they recover. Many thousands never will. Their lungs will be permanently damaged, their eyes will be permanently damaged from the gas. It's science and the hopefulness of science turned into a weapon. And what we get is after a stagnant period of time with attacks over the same land, with poison gas now being used, we get scenes such as this. Captured bunkers, bodies that have lain out in no man's land so long that they have been stripped of their flesh by the rats, or they've laid there long enough to rot. It's a horrific assault on the senses. This is going to have an effect on the generation of veterans who come home from the First World War. We'll talk about that in our next lecture. On the American home front, the war is a separate world. We don't have pictures of muddy trenches and decayed bodies laying out in the open. We have people that are called upon for voluntary rationing. On Monday, don't eat any meat so that our soldiers can have meat. We have wheatless Wednesdays so that we can have wheat for the people living over, the soldiers serving overseas. Grow a victory garden so that you can feed yourself and be patriotic. Go on scrap drives, collect rubber and tin and recyclable materials in order to have them present for the war effort. Women are encouraged to get jobs in factories to help with the fight, besides being involved in food production. You'll also see things like the Women's Land Army. If a million men are overseas now serving in the military, we need people to grow food. We need people to serve on farms. So the Women's Land Army will open up as a means for patriotic women to help the war effort. We'll see the rise of daylight savings time, which I still can't fully understand or comprehend, and which still pisses us off twice a year. We'll also have the crushing of civil liberties. If you remember, I talked about Eugene V. Debs, socialist candidate for president in 1912. Debs will go to jail in 1917 for denouncing the war as a means of the capitalist rich enslaving the working class and using them to serve the needs of making the military manufacturer rich. If you speak German in the United States, you'll be seen as a traitor. So we'll force German speakers underground. We'll see situations where I grew up in Davenport, Iowa. Davenport was a heavily German populated area in World War at the beginning of the 20th century, thanks to earlier migrations. A good probably 25 to 30% of this high school library in Davenport was comprised of books in German. And most of not all of those books were burned at the beginning of America's involvement in the First World War as a means of showing patriotism. You did everything you could to crush the German menace, including burning books, to show that you were loyal to the president, not loyal to the Kaiser, to show Germans that they needed to speak English, not speak German if they wanted to be loyal Americans. So what's the human cost of war? The war to end all wars was the first time that we see death on a magnificent scale. Before American involvement in the Battle of the Somme in 1916, in one day there's 57,000 British casualties. 1.1 million British soldiers will die between 1914 and 1918. 1.8 million Germans will die. Only 116,000 Americans will die. Total military dead, 8.3 million soldiers. Another 8 million civilians in mainland Europe will be killed. It's the first time we've seen destruction on this level, and humanity doesn't know how to react to it. The end of the war comes with the American involvement and reinforcement of the Allies. In the fall of 1918, we'll see the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where the Americans will push the Germans back further and further. The Central Powers will begin to fall apart. The Ottoman Turks will seek a separate peace. The Austrians, the Austro-Hungarian army will begin to fall apart. The Germans will fall apart, and they will seek a surrender before mainland Germany can be invaded. The armistice will go into effect at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. It will be called Armistice Day. For decades, it still is in England. The Treaty of Versailles will take another year to negotiate. The Treaty of Versailles is not the good way to end a war. It is the classic European way to end a war. We will force Germany, even though it did not cause the war, even though it did not start the war, we see Germany as the major belligerent. We will force them to pay back debts or to pay a debt for causing the war. Little bit of trivia. The Germans did not finish paying off their World War I reparations until 5 years ago. Yeah, 2013. That's when the Germans finished paying off their World War I debts. Even after the Second World War, even after everything that's gone on, we still forced Germany to continue paying its debt to the French and the British for nearly a century. We'll take land from Germany and Hungary, Austria-Hungary. We'll partition and create new countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Poland. And we'll strip Germany of its military, of its right to even have an army large enough to defend itself, because it is seen that any German state with an army is potentially an invading state, a state that will cause a war. The Treaty of Versailles will carry hard feelings. It'll also never be ratified by the American Senate, but that's a whole other story that we don't have time for, unfortunately. But right on the tail end of the First World War, this little ditty becomes a popular rhyme in the United States. I had a little bird, its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza. On the tail end of the First World War, the Spanish flu, the quote-unquote Spanish flu, will become one of the great global pandemics of human history. We call it the Spanish flu because Spain wasn't involved in the First World War and didn't have a media blackout, so people followed along as the king and queen got sick, as people across Spain died by the thousands of this flu epidemic. It actually started, as best as we know, in an American training camp in Kansas, and it was spread to Europe and around the world by American soldiers. What's so horrible about this type of flu is that this strain of flu actually killed the young and the healthy. Statistically, the flu kills the old, the people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who have lowered immune systems. It also kills the very young, the kids under 10. The Spanish flu killed college-aged young people. It killed the people most likely to have the best immune systems. Up to 100 million people worldwide will die of the flu during the waning years of the First World War. More Americans will die of the flu than actually died of combat-related causes. And those 675,000, that's not just relegated to military camps. The picture we have on the screen here is a picture of the state gym facility on the Iowa State University campus. So many people on campus got sick that they had to sequester the gymnasium building to make it into a makeshift hospital, and they had to put a military guard around campus to keep people from going back and forth in order to try and stop the spread of the flu. That happens on almost every college campus in the United States. It sweeps the country, it sweeps the world. 5% of the global population possibly died in that between 1915 and 1920 of the Spanish flu. And there was nothing we could do to stop it. We had no antibiotics. The only thing you can do with the flu is to let it pass, and you knew you were going to die of the Spanish flu probably within about 24 to 36 hours. There are some really horrible accounts out there of what the Spanish flu did to people. And I know that's a depressing note to end on, but World War I can't be talked about without the massive amount of death that swept the world. And we wouldn't have had the Spanish flu pandemic if there hadn't been the First World War, to be brutally honest. We need to have Americans going overseas and exposing other people and other armies to this disease in order to see it successfully spread. We'll talk more next time about the 1920s and the rise of American culture and the rejection of the progressives in the wake of the war. Thank you very much for your time. I hope everybody has a great day.